The phone rang at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would change everything, and Jack Brennan almost didn't answer until he heard the voice that made his hands tremble. "Mr. Brennan, this is Preston Montgomery. I'm standing outside your shop right now with some people who want to meet you. What you've done with that Ferrari V12 engine has changed everything." Through his grimy garage window, Jack could see 3 black SUVs and men in expensive suits, all because 2 weeks ago he'd accepted an impossible $50,000 bet from a stranger named Connor Davis to repair a 1973 Ferrari Daytona engine that 7 different mechanics had declared completely unfixable, not knowing it belonged to Preston's dead son, David, or that his success would unlock a chain of events that would transform not just his failing auto shop and his daughter's future, but the entire struggling town of Steelton, Georgia. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. 2 weeks. Earlier, the morning sun cast long shadows across Gearworks Boulevard as Jack Brennan unlocked the bay doors of his auto repair shop. The metal squealed in protest, much like everything else in his life lately. Paint peeled from the concrete block walls, and oil stains mapped decades of hard work across the cracked floor. The sign above the entrance read, "Brennan's Auto Repair. Honest work, fair prices," though Jack wondered how much longer those words would mean anything. He flipped the switch for the overhead fluorescents, and half of them flickered to life, while the others remained stubbornly dark. Another expense he couldn't afford. The morning ritual continued as he started the ancient coffee maker, its gurgling the only sound in the cavernous space that smelled of motor oil, metal shavings, and fading dreams. "Morning, Mr. B." Mason Garcia's voice echoed from the entrance as the young man wheeled his bicycle through the door. At 28, Mason had been working at the shop for 3 years, ever since Jack had caught him trying to hotwire a car in the parking lot behind Rita's Corner Diner. Instead of calling the police, Jack had offered him a job. "Morning, Mason. How's your grandmother doing?" "Better, thanks. The medication you helped pay for is working." Mason hung his helmet on a hook and grabbed his coveralls from a locker. "What's on the schedule today?" Jack glanced at the appointment. "A book, its pages more empty than full. Mrs. Williams is bringing in her Buick for an oil change around 10. Eddie Patterson needs his transmission looked at, but he's still deciding if he can afford the repair." The reality hung heavy between them. Eddie Patterson, like half the people in Steelton, was struggling to make ends meet. The steel mill had closed 2 years ago, taking most of the town's decent-paying jobs with it. People were holding onto their cars longer, patching and praying instead of properly fixing. Jack understood. He was doing the same thing with his business. "Mr. B, I've been thinking." Mason pulled on his work boots, laces frayed but still holding. "Maybe we should expand our services. I've been watching YouTube videos about hybrid repairs, and there's good money in that." "With what capital, Mason? We can barely keep the lights on." Jack's voice carried the weight of 3 months behind on rent, a daughter heading to college, and a banknote that grew more threatening with each passing day. The bell above the front door chimed, and both men looked up to see Connor Davis enter. He appeared to be in his late 30s, wearing clean but modest clothes. Dark jeans, a button-down shirt that had seen better days, and work boots that suggested he knew his way around machinery. What struck Jack wasn't his appearance, but the way he carried himself, like a man accustomed to being in control, even when he was trying not to show it. "You Jack Brennan?" "That's me. What can I do for you?" Connor glanced around the shop, his eyes taking in every detail. The organized tool rack, the clean workbenches despite their age, the methodical way parts were sorted and labeled. "I hear you're good with engines. Been working on them for 27 years. What's the problem?" "It's not exactly a problem, more like a proposition." Connor reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. How would you feel about making $50,000? Mason dropped the wrench he'd been holding. It clattered against the concrete, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. Jack felt his stomach tighten. In his experience, propositions that started with large sums of money usually ended badly. Depends on what I'd have to do for it. Fix an engine. Must be some engine for that kind of money. Connor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. 1973 Ferrari Daytona V12. Some people say it can't be fixed. Jack had worked on Ferraris before, back when he was younger, and the shop attracted customers from Atlanta who had money to burn on exotic cars. The Daytona was legendary, a front-engine grand tourer with a temperamental but beautiful V12 that could make grown men weep when it ran properly. What's wrong with it? 7 mechanics have tried to rebuild it. 2 of them were Ferrari specialists with factory training. All of them gave up. Connor set the envelope on the workbench. This contains half the money. You get the rest when the engine runs. And if I can't fix it, then you keep the $25,000 for trying. Mason stepped closer, his eyes wide. $25,000 was more than they made in 6 good months. $50,000 would save the shop, pay off the bank, and give Ava the college fund she deserved. What's the catch? Jack asked. In his experience, deals that seemed too good to be true usually were. No catch, just a time limit. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to rebuild a Ferrari V12 that 7 other mechanics couldn't fix. That's right. Jack studied Connor's face, looking for tells. The man's expression remained neutral, professional. But there was something else there, desperation maybe, or grief. Whatever was driving this offer ran deeper than money. Where's the engine? I'll have it delivered this afternoon, along with all the documentation from the previous attempts. Documentation, work orders, parts lists, diagnostic reports, everything. The other mechanics tried. That was unusual. Most people didn't keep detailed records of failed repairs, especially not failures that cost them money. Someone wanted this engine fixed badly enough to create a paper trail of everything that hadn't worked. I need to know more about the car's history, accident damage, modifications, anything that might affect the rebuild. Connor nodded approvingly. Smart questions. The car was in an accident 3 years ago. Single vehicle driver error. The impact damaged the engine mounts and cracked the block, but it's all repairable damage. The engine ran before the accident. Ran well, actually. Driver make it? Connor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. No, I'm sorry. Thank you. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. This wasn't just about fixing an engine. This was about something deeper, more personal. Jack had seen it before in customers who brought in cars that belonged to people they'd lost. Sometimes fixing the machine was the only way to heal the heart. Mr. B. Mason's voice was barely above a whisper. $25,000 just for trying. Jack picked up the envelope. It was thick, substantial, real money for real work. But taking it would mean committing to something that had already defeated 7 other mechanics, including experts. Why me? Jack asked. If Ferrari specialists couldn't do it, what makes you think I can? Because you're not a specialist. You're a mechanic. Connor's voice carried respect, not condescension. The specialists know what should work according to the manual. You know what actually works in the real world. It was a distinction Jack understood. Factory training taught you to replace parts by the book. Years of experience taught you to find creative solutions when the book was wrong. I'll need to see the engine before I decide. Fair enough. It'll be here by 3 o'clock. Connor headed toward the door, then paused. Jack, the people who owned this engine, they're good people. They've been carrying this weight for 3 years. If you can lift it, you'll be doing more than fixing a machine. After Connor left, Mason stood staring at the envelope like it might disappear if he looked away. Mr. B, we have to take this job. It's not that simple, Mason. If 7 mechanics couldn't do it, there's probably a good reason. But $25,000 just for trying. That pays the rent for the rest of the year. Jack knew Mason was right. They were 3 months behind on everything, and Carol Morrison at the bank had been increasingly pointed in her reminders about the loan payment. Ava had been accepted to Georgia Tech, but without money for tuition, she'd end up working at the diner like her mother had before she died. Let's see the engine first, then we'll decide. The rest of the morning passed in routine maintenance, oil changes, brake pads, simple repairs that kept food on the table but wouldn't save the business. At 2:45, a flatbed truck turned onto Gearworks Boulevard, carrying what looked like a small crane and several wooden crates. The driver was a professional hauler who clearly transported expensive cargo regularly. He handled the crates with practiced care, using the crane to lower them into the shop bay. Once he left, Jack and Mason stood looking at 3 wooden crates that contained either their salvation or their biggest mistake. "Well," Jack said, reaching for his crowbar, "let's see what $50,000 looks like." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The first crate revealed the Ferrari's V12 block, and Jack immediately understood why 7 mechanics had walked away. The aluminum casting was cracked along 3 separate stress lines, spider webbing from the cylinder head mounting points down. Toward the crankcase, metal fatigue from the accident had created fractures that would normally require complete replacement, except Ferrari hadn't manufactured this particular block variant since 1975. "Jesus," Mason whispered, running his fingers along the damaged surface. "How do you even begin to fix this?" Jack knelt beside the engine, his trained eye following the crack patterns. "You don't fix it the way the manual tells you to. You fix it the way physics demands." He pointed to where the cracks intersected. "See how they radiate. This wasn't just impact damage. The engine was already stressed before the accident." The second crate contained the cylinder heads, intake manifold, and a collection of internal components that told a story of failed attempts. Some parts were clearly new. Replacement pistons still in their packaging, a rebuilt crankshaft with machine marks indicating recent work. Others showed the scars of multiple rebuilds, bolt holes that had been helicoiled, surfaces that had been machined and remachined. "Look at this." Mason held up a connecting rod. "Someone tried to balance these by hand grinding. That's why the engine vibrated itself apart." The third crate held the real treasure, 3 ring binders filled with documentation. Jack opened the first one to find detailed photographs, diagnostic reports, and handwritten notes from each mechanic who had attempted the rebuild. The Ferrari specialists had focused on returning everything to factory specifications, replacing parts that met tolerances but ignoring the fundamental stress issues. The independent mechanics had tried various shortcuts, none addressing the root cause. "They all made the same mistake," Jack said, flipping through the reports. "They treated the symptoms instead of the disease." The bell chimed as Tony Romano entered the shop. At 62, Tony had taught Jack most of what he knew about engines during Jack's early years at Romano's import service. Arthritis had forced Tony into semi-retirement, but he still consulted on difficult jobs and remained the closest thing to a father figure Jack had after his own dad died. "Heard you got something interesting in here." Tony's weathered hands were already reaching for the engine block. "Connor Davis told me you might need some advice. You know Connor? We've met. Good man carrying a heavy load." Tony examined the cracks with the same methodical approach he'd taught Jack decades ago. "This is David Montgomery's engine." The name hit Jack like cold water. Montgomery, as in Montgomery Industries, the company that had bought and closed the steel mill. The same Montgomery family that half the town blamed for Steelton's economic collapse. Preston Montgomery's son, his boy David, Kid was 22, brilliant engineer, loved fast cars more than was good for him. Tony's voice carried the sadness of someone who'd watched a young man make a fatal mistake. This engine was his project. Spent 2 years modifying it. Custom cam, balanced internals, electronic fuel injection adapted from a newer model. That explains the stress fractures. He was pushing more power than the block was designed to handle. 350 horsepower from an engine built for 260. David was good, but he was young. Thought he could engineer his way around the laws of physics. Mason looked between the two older men. So the accident? Speed, Tony said simply. Kid took a curve on Highway 41 at 90 in a car built for 70. Probably never felt a thing. The shop fell quiet, except for the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of traffic on Gearworks Boulevard. Jack studied the documentation again, understanding now why Connor had been so specific about the 2-week deadline. Why the money was so important, and why 7 mechanics had failed. They weren't just trying to fix an engine, Jack said. They were trying to fix a tragedy. And you can't do that, Tony agreed. But you might be able to build something better than what came before. The front door opened again, and Ava Brennan walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee from Rita's diner. At 16, she was already showing the mechanical intuition that ran in the Brennan family, though she planned to study engineering rather than follow her father into the repair business. Thought you might need caffeine. She handed Jack 1 cup and offered the other to Mason. Dad, Mrs. Morrison from the bank called. She wants to see you tomorrow morning. Jack's stomach tightened. Carol Morrison only called for meetings when the news was bad. What time? 9 o'clock. She said to bring your loan documents. The weight of the Ferrari project suddenly felt heavier. This wasn't just about proving he could fix what others couldn't. It was about saving everything he'd built over the past 15 years. Ava, I need you to do something for me. Call Dr. Wells at the community college and ask if she's still teaching that materials engineering course. Why? Because I think we're going to need some expert advice on aluminum welding, Tony raised an eyebrow. You thinking about welding those cracks? Not welding, rebuilding. If we're going to fix this engine properly, we need to address David's modifications while solving the structural problems he created. Over the next hour, Jack and Tony developed a plan that would have horrified the Ferrari specialists, but made perfect sense to mechanics who'd spent decades making the impossible work. Instead of trying to return the engine to factory specifications, they would embrace David's vision while correcting his mistakes. First thing, Jack said, sketching on a notepad, we need to relieve the stress concentrations. These cracks follow the cylinder bore center lines because that's where the combustion pressure peaks. So we machine relief channels, Tony nodded. Redirect the forces to stronger areas of the casting. Then we use the cracks themselves as expansion joints. Fill them with a material that can flex without breaking. That's not standard practice, Mason said. Standard practice already failed 7 times, Jack replied. We're going to do something different. By 4 o'clock, they had a preliminary plan and a parts list that would cost $18,000, money Jack didn't have but would need to invest to earn the remaining $25,000. It was a gamble that could save his business or destroy it completely. I need to make some calls, Jack said. Tony, can you stay with the engine? I don't want it left alone. Planning to sleep with it too, if I have to. The next few hours blurred together as Jack worked the phone, calling suppliers, former customers, and anyone who might extend credit for parts. The Ferrari community was small and specialized, but Jack's reputation for honest work had earned him connections that proved valuable now. Mike Sullivan at Atlanta Motorsports agreed to sell him pistons at cost. Dr. Patricia Wells from the community college offered access to their metallurgy lab for stress analysis. Even Eddie Patterson, whose transmission repair had been postponed, volunteered to help with labor in exchange for learning advanced engine work. By closing time, Jack had commitments for most of the needed parts and enough volunteer help to attempt the impossible. The financial risk was still enormous, but the plan was becoming real. "You sure about this, Mr. B?" Mason asked as they locked up the shop. "If this doesn't work, then we'll be broke doing something incredible instead of broke doing nothing." Jack looked back at the Ferrari engine, now covered with a tarp, but somehow still commanding the space. "Besides, I think David Montgomery deserves to have his vision completed properly." As they walked to their vehicles, Tony lingered behind. "Jack, there's something else you should know about Connor Davis." "What's that?" "He's not just some middleman. He worked for Preston Montgomery for 12 years, right up until David died. Used to be the kid's racing mechanic. So this is personal for him too. More than personal. Connor blames himself for not stopping David from pushing that engine so hard. He's been carrying that guilt for 3 years, same as Preston." Jack understood now why Connor had seemed so desperate beneath his professional exterior. This wasn't just about fixing an engine. It was about 3 people trying to find peace after a tragedy that had torn their lives apart. The evening air was thick with humidity as Jack drove home, his mind already working through the technical challenges ahead. The crack repair would require precision welding, followed by stress relief heat treatment. The electronic fuel injection system would need complete recalibration for the modified displacement. The internal balancing would take days of patient work, but for the first time in months, Jack felt something he'd almost forgotten. Excitement about a challenging job that would push every skill he'd developed over nearly 3 decades of engine work. At Rita's Corner Diner, he stopped for dinner and found half the town talking about the mysterious Ferrari delivery to Brennan's Auto Repair. Rita Patterson herself brought his usual coffee and meatloaf. "Heard you took on something big, Jack. News travels fast." "In a town this size, faster than gossip," she lowered her voice. "People are rooting for you, you know. We all want to see you succeed. Even if it's working on a Montgomery project." Rita's expression hardened slightly. Preston Montgomery wasn't popular in Steelton, but she was too diplomatic to say so directly. The sins of the father aren't the sins of the son. That boy David was different from his old man. As Jack ate his dinner, he realized the entire town was watching this project. Success would prove that Steelton still had craftsmen capable of world-class work. Failure would confirm what many people already believed, that their best days were behind them. The stakes had just gotten bigger than $50,000. The meeting with Carol Morrison went exactly as Jack expected. Badly. She sat across from him in the bank's sterile conference room, loan documents spread between them like evidence in a trial where the verdict was already decided. "Jack, I've known you since high school. I don't want to do this, but the board is pressuring me." Her voice carried genuine regret. "You're 4 months behind on the business loan, 3 months on the property mortgage. The numbers don't lie. I've got a job that'll bring in $50,000. "When?" 2 weeks. Carol leaned back in her chair. "Jack, you've been saying next month for 6 months. I need something concrete." Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out Connor's envelope, still thick with $25,000 in cash. Carol's eyes widened as he opened it on the table. "This is the down payment. I get the rest when I complete the job." "What kind of job?" "Pays $50,000 in Steelton, the kind that nobody else can do." Carol studied the money, clearly calculating. "This covers your immediate arrears, but what about next month? And the month after that? If I pull this off, word will spread. People will know that Brennan's Auto Repair can handle the impossible jobs. And if you don't," Jack met her eyes. Then you'll have your money anyway and I'll figure out something else." 30 minutes later, Jack walked out of First National. With his loans current and a 90-day extension, it wasn't salvation, but it was breathing room. The real pressure now came from the ticking clock. 12 days to complete what 7 mechanics couldn't do. Back at the shop, he found Mason and Eddie Patterson carefully disassembling the Ferrari's cylinder heads, while Tony supervised. The work area had been transformed overnight into something resembling a surgical suite, with bright work lights and clean white tarps covering every surface. "How'd it go with the bank?" Mason asked, without looking up from the delicate valve train. "Components. We're current. For now." Eddie whistled softly. Must be some job to make Carol Morrison smile. She didn't exactly smile. More like a reprieve from execution. Dr. Patricia Wells arrived at 10 o'clock with equipment that belonged in a laboratory, not an auto shop. The portable ultrasonic scanner could detect flaws in metal invisible to the human eye, while her stress analysis software would help predict how modifications would affect the engine's durability. "This is fascinating," she said, running the scanner along the cracked cylinder block. "The fracture patterns tell a complete story about the forces that destroyed this engine." On her laptop screen, colored stress maps showed how combustion pressure had concentrated at weak points in the casting. David's modifications had increased power, but the additional stress had exceeded the aluminum's fatigue limit. "Here's the problem." Dr. Wells pointed to areas of red on the stress map. These bolt bosses were designed for the original power output. When David increased combustion pressure, the forces had nowhere to go except through these failure points. "So we reinforce the weak areas," Jack said. "Not just reinforce, redistribute. If we add material here and here," she indicated specific locations, "we can create new load paths that spread the stress over a larger area." The solution was elegant in its simplicity, but complex in execution. They would machine precision channels into the block, then fill them with a specially formulated aluminum-bronze alloy that was both stronger and more flexible than the original material. The result would be an engine block that could handle David's power modifications without the structural failures that had plagued the original. By noon, they had a complete metallurgical plan and a parts list that made Jack's stomach clench. The specialized alloy alone would cost $4,000, and that was just the beginning. "I know a guy," Tony said, studying the requirements. "Runs a racing shop in Charlotte. Owes me a favor from 20 years ago." "What kind of favor?" "The kind that saved his marriage and his business. He'll help." While Tony made calls, Jack and Mason began the painstaking process of measuring every component. The Ferrari's tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch, and David's modifications had pushed some dimensions beyond factory specifications. Every piston, connecting rod and bearing would need individual attention. "Mr. B, look at this." Mason held up one of the pistons, pointing to barely visible marks on the crown. "These aren't impact marks from the accident. This is detonation damage." Jack examined the pitting carefully. David was running too much timing advance. The engine was destroying itself even before the crash, so fixing the cracks won't be enough, not even close. "We need to rebuild this thing from the ground up, but do it right this time." The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors. Word had spread through Steelton's tight-knit community that Brennan's Auto Repair was attempting something extraordinary. Rita Patterson stopped by with sandwiches and stayed to watch the precision measuring process. Father Miguel Rodriguez blessed the engine, half joking that it might need divine intervention. Most surprising was Billy Torres, who owned the competing auto shop on the other side of town. Jack and Billy had maintained a professional rivalry for years, competing for the same customers in a market too small to support both shops comfortably. "Heard you took on the Montgomery job," Billy said, examining the disassembled engine with professional interest. "News travels fast. Faster when people are hoping you'll fail." Jack looked up from his work. "And you?" Billy was quiet for a moment. "My dad worked at the steel mill for 37 years. When Montgomery Industries closed it down, he never found another job that paid half as much." He picked up one of the damaged pistons, turning it in his weathered hands. "But that boy, David, he wasn't his father. Kid used to bring his car to my shop sometimes, ask questions about engine tuning. He was trying to learn the right way." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying if you need parts, I've got a contact in Miami who specializes in Ferrari engines." "No. Markup? Just cost? Why would you help me?" Billy set down the piston and looked directly at Jack. "Because if you can pull this off, it proves that small-town mechanics can still do world-class work. That's good for all of us." By 4 o'clock, the shop had become an unlikely collaboration hub. Dr. Wells had set up her equipment in the corner, running continuous stress analysis on each component. Tony was coordinating parts deliveries from 3 different states. Eddie Patterson was learning precision measuring techniques that would serve him well in future jobs. The real breakthrough came when Mason discovered something in David's engineering. Notes, detailed drawings hidden in the back of one of the binders that showed a completely different approach to the engine's internal balance. "Look at this." Mason spread the drawings across the workbench. David wasn't just increasing power, he was trying to reduce vibration by changing the firing order. Jack studied the complex calculations. The kid was more sophisticated than I thought. This isn't just hot rodding, this is serious engineering. But the other mechanics didn't understand what he was trying to do, Dr. Wells added, looking over Jack's shoulder. They rebuilt it to factory specifications and undid all his improvements. That's why it kept failing. They weren't fixing David's mistakes, they were erasing his innovations. The revelation changed everything. Instead of correcting David's work, they would complete it. The young engineer had been on the right track, but he died before he could finish developing his ideas. 3 years later, Jack was in a position to honor David's vision while fixing the execution problems that had led to tragedy. "This is going to take longer than I thought," Jack said, studying the complexity of David's modifications. "How much longer?" Mason asked. "If we do it right, exactly right, we'll need every minute of the 2 weeks Connor gave us." That evening, Jack sat in his kitchen, reviewing David's engineering notes while Ava worked on her college applications at the other end of the table. The young man's handwriting revealed a methodical mind, grappling with complex problems, trying to push the boundaries of what was possible with 1970s technology. "Dad, you've been staring at those papers for an hour without turning a page, just thinking about the engine, about the kid who designed it. He was probably brilliant, but he was working alone. If he'd had experienced people to guide him, he might still be alive." Jack nodded. "Experience matters, Ava. Knowledge without wisdom can be dangerous. Is that why you're so careful about everything? When you're working with forces that can kill people, careful isn't optional." Ava closed her laptop and moved to the chair next to her father. "Tell me about this engine. Really tell me." For the next hour, Jack explained the technical challenges, the community pressure, and the weight of working on a dead man's dream. Ava listened with the focused attention she'd inherited from her mother, asking questions that revealed her engineering intuition. "So you're not just fixing an engine," she said finally. "You're finishing what David started." That's one way to look at it. It's the right way to look at it. Mom would have understood that. Grace Brennan had died of cancer 2 years ago, but her influence on both Jack and Ava remained strong. She'd believed in completing meaningful work, in honoring commitments even when they became difficult, in finding purpose beyond mere survival. "She would have told me to take the job," Jack said. She would have told you to do it right, regardless of the cost. That night, Jack dreamed of engines and equations, of a young man's ambitions and an older man's responsibility to see them through. When he woke at dawn, his mind was clear about what needed to be done. The real work was about to begin. The specialized alloy arrived from Charlotte at 6 in the morning, delivered by a driver who'd driven through the night. Jack signed for the shipment while Mason and Eddie unloaded 50 pounds of aluminum bronze ingots that would either save the project or bankrupt him completely. $4,000 of metal, Mason said, hefting one of the bars. Feels like holding rent money. Feels like holding possibility, Jack corrected, but his stomach agreed with Mason's assessment. Dr. Wells arrived with her portable welding equipment and a stern expression. Before we begin the metallurgical work, I need you to understand something. This alloy requires precise temperature control. Too hot and it becomes brittle. Too cool and it won't bond properly. The margin for error is less than 50 degrees. How precise is precise? Pyrometer readings every 30 seconds, controlled atmosphere, preheat and post-heat cycling. This isn't backyard welding, Jack. This is materials science. The first attempt to weld the stress relief channels was a disaster. Despite careful temperature monitoring, the joint cracked during cooling, ruining 6 hours of preparation and $300 worth of alloy. Jack stared at the failed weld, feeling the weight of diminishing time and resources. What went wrong? Eddie asked. Thermal expansion mismatch, Dr. Wells explained, examining the fracture under magnification. The alloy expanded faster than the aluminum block during heating. So we're stuck? No, we're learning. This is why prototypes exist. Tony suggested a solution that violated every modern welding textbook but made perfect sense to anyone who'd worked with dissimilar metals for decades. Instead of trying to match thermal expansion rates, they would use the mismatch deliberately, creating controlled stress that would actually strengthen the joint. It's counterintuitive, Tony explained, sketching on a napkin from Rita's diner. But if we pre-stress the alloy in the opposite direction, the thermal expansion will bring it into perfect tension when the engine reaches operating temperature. That's either brilliant or insane, Dr. Wells said. Sometimes there's no difference, Jack replied. The second attempt took 14 hours. Working in shifts, they preheated the engine block to exactly 847 degrees Fahrenheit, applied the alloy in multiple thin layers, then controlled the cooling cycle with thermal blankets and careful timing. When the final weld cooled, ultrasonic. Testing revealed a joint stronger than the original casting. Sweet Mary and Joseph, Tony whispered, studying the test results. We actually did it. The victory was short-lived. While the stress relief channels were perfect, the cylinder bore measurements revealed another problem. David's modifications had included oversized pistons that required machining the bores beyond standard dimensions. Previous mechanics had tried to correct this by installing sleeve inserts, but the sleeves had shifted during the accident, creating uneven compression ratios. We need to remove all the sleeves and start over, Jack said, measuring the bore distortion. But that means machining the block to the next oversize, which pistons aren't available for, Mason added, consulting their parts catalogs. Then we make them. Eddie looked up from cleaning valve springs. Make pistons? From scratch? It's been done before, Tony said. During the war, we made everything from scratch. No reason we can't do it now. The piston manufacturing project required resources Jack didn't have and expertise that pushed everyone to their limits. Dr. Wells contacted her colleague at Georgia Tech, who specialized in precision machining. Billy Torres provided access to his shop's CNC mill during off hours. Father Miguel convinced the church board to loan the money for raw aluminum stock, calling it an investment in community pride. This town is betting on you, Rita Patterson said, delivering coffee and sandwiches to the increasingly cluttered shop. Half the people at the diner have never seen a Ferrari engine, but they're following this project like it's the playoffs. No, pressure, Jack muttered, but he was touched by the support. The piston machining began on day 8 of the 2-week deadline. Working from David's original specifications modified for the new bore dimensions, they turned raw aluminum into precision. Components on equipment borrowed from 3 different shops. Each piston required 16 hours of machine work, and they needed 12 pistons to account for potential failures. The first piston came off the mill looking perfect but failed dimensional inspection by 0.003 of an inch. A microscopic error that would cause catastrophic engine failure. The second piston was dimensionally perfect, but developed hairline cracks during stress testing. The third piston met all specifications and passed every test. 9 more to go, Mason said, studying the work schedule. 48 hours left, and we need 16 hours per piston. Then we work in shifts around the clock, Jack said. I'll take midnight to 8. Tony, can you handle 8 to 4? These old bones can handle whatever they need to handle. Dr. Wells volunteered for the 4 to midnight shift, despite having classes to teach at the community college. My students can wait. This is more important than theoretical metallurgy. The shop transformed into a 24-hour operation. Neighbors brought food at all hours. Mason's grandmother sent homemade soup. Father Miguel stopped by at midnight to check on progress and stayed until dawn, learning to operate the ultrasonic testing equipment. On day 10, disaster struck again. A power surge from a thunderstorm damaged the CNC mill's control computer, threatening to end the project with 2 pistons still unfinished. Billy Torres drove to Atlanta in the rain to borrow replacement parts from a contact at a racing shop, returning at 3 in the morning with components that weren't quite compatible, but could be modified to work. Why? Jack asked as Billy crawled under the machine to install the replacement controller. You're losing sleep and money to help a competitor. Because 37 years ago, my dad helped build this town's steel mill, Billy said, without stopping his work. When it closed, part of this town died with it. But if you can make this Ferrari sing, maybe we prove that Steelton still builds things that matter. The final pistons were completed with 18 hours to spare, but installing them revealed another challenge. David's connecting rods had been lightened and balanced, but the balancing was incomplete. Each rod had a different weight, creating vibrations that would tear the engine apart at high RPM. He ran out of time, Tony said, weighing each connecting rod on a precision scale. Probably died before he could finish the balance work. So we finish it for him. The connecting rod balancing required equipment the shop didn't have, a specialized machine that could remove material in precise amounts from specific locations. The nearest shop with the right equipment was in Birmingham, Alabama, a 4-hour drive each way. With 16 hours remaining until Connor's deadline, Mason volunteered to make the drive. I'll leave now, get there when they open, wait for the work to be done, and drive straight back. That's cutting it close. Everything about this project has been cutting it close. While Mason raced toward Birmingham with a box of connecting rods, Jack and the team began final assembly of the engine components they could install without the rods. The cylinder heads went on with new gaskets, torqued to David's specifications rather than factory settings. The cam timing was set according to David's notes, which called for more aggressive overlap than Ferrari had originally designed. This is either going to run like a dream or explode spectacularly, Tony said, installing the custom welded oil pan. David's notes are pretty detailed, Dr. Wells said, double-checking the valve timing. He knew what he was doing theoretically. The execution was just incomplete. Father Miguel had remained at the shop all night, partly to help, but mostly to witness what he called a resurrection of dreams. As dawn broke on the final day, He led an impromptu prayer circle that included Jack, Tony, Dr. Wells, Eddie, Rita, and 6 other neighbors who'd been following the project. Lord, bless the work of these hands and the memory of the young man whose vision we seek to complete, Father Miguel intoned. Grant that this engine may run not in anger or pride, but in honor of human ingenuity and the bonds of community. Amen, everyone said, even Tony, who hadn't been inside a church in 20 years. Mason called from Birmingham at 10 o'clock. The rods are done and they're perfect, but there's a problem. What kind of problem? My truck broke down in the shop parking lot. Transmission gave out completely. Jack's heart sank. 8 hours until deadline, and their critical components were stranded 4 hours away. I'm calling around for a ride, Mason continued. Somebody's got to be heading toward Georgia. How long will that take? I don't know, Mr. B. I'm doing everything I can. As Jack hung up, he realized the project that had brought the community together might fail due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. With 8 hours remaining, they could only wait and hope that Mason would find a way home. The longest day of Jack's life was about to get longer. At 11:30, Mason called, with news that changed everything. Mr. B, you're not going to believe this. There's a guy here with a helicopter. A what? Helicopter. Says he heard about our situation on the radio. He's offering to fly the connecting rods to Steelton. Jack felt his knees weaken. Who is this? Guy. Name's Captain Hayes. Retired Army, runs medical transport flights. He says sometimes people need help, and this sounds like one of those times. 2 hours later, the distinctive thump of rotor blades echoed across Gearworks Boulevard as a civilian medical helicopter settled onto the empty lot next to the shop. Half the town had gathered to watch Mason climb out with a precious cargo box, followed by a gray-haired pilot who waved off offers of payment. Gas money's enough, Captain Hayes said when Jack tried to hand him an envelope. Radio said you're trying to finish some young man's work. My boy's about that age. I'd want someone to help him if he needed it. The connecting rods were perfect. Balanced to within 0.5 gram across all 12 cylinders. David's original weights were marked on each rod in his careful handwriting, and the Birmingham shop had achieved those specifications exactly. 6 hours to deadline, Tony said, checking his watch. Can we install 12 rods, pistons, and get this thing running in 6 hours? We're about to find out. The final assembly became a ballet of precision and urgency. Jack and Tony worked on opposite sides of the engine, installing pistons and rods in carefully orchestrated sequence. Dr. Wells monitored torque specifications, while Eddie and Mason prepared ancillary components. Father Miguel, who'd become surprisingly adept at organizing small parts, laid out bolts and gaskets in the exact order they'd be needed. Piston number 7's going in, Jack called out, guiding the connecting rod onto the crankshaft journal. Torque to 65 foot-pounds, then quarter turn. Confirmed 65 1/4, Dr. Wells responded, checking her calibrated wrench. By 3 o'clock, the engine was mechanically complete, except for the fuel injection system, David's most complex modification. The original Ferrari had used 6 Weber carburetors, but David had designed a custom electronic fuel injection setup adapted from a later model. His notes included detailed wiring diagrams and fuel maps, but translating 3-year-old paperwork into a running system required educated guesswork. This is where it gets interesting, Jack said, studying David's electrical schematics. He was trying to achieve optimal fuel delivery across the entire RPM range, but the computer technology wasn't quite there yet. What do you mean? Mason asked. He had the right idea, but limited tools, like trying to paint the Mona Lisa with house paint brushes. The fuel injection computer was a custom unit David had built himself, housed in a military surplus electronics case. Inside, circuit boards revealed the work of someone who understood programming but had to improvise solutions with 1970s components. "Look at this," Dr. Wells said, tracing connections on the main board. He hand-wired feedback loops that wouldn't become standard until the 1990s. This kid was 20 years ahead of his time. But did he make it work? According to his test logs, the system ran for 47 minutes before the accident, not enough time to fully debug the programming. With 3 hours remaining, they faced a choice: install David's experimental fuel injection system and risk failure, or retrofit the engine with carburetors that would work but compromise David's vision. "We stick with his design," Jack decided. "If we're going to honor his memory, we do it completely." The fuel injection installation required connecting 63 individual wires according to David's diagrams, calibrating 12 injectors, and programming the computer with fuel maps that existed only in handwritten notes. Mistakes would be invisible until they tried to start the engine, and there wouldn't be time for corrections. "Wire 37, blue with white stripe, connects to injector bank 2, cylinder 3 signal," Jack read from David's notes while Mason made the connection. "Confirmed," Mason replied, then moved to the next wire in sequence. At 5 o'clock, Connor Davis appeared in the shop doorway. His usually composed expression showed signs of strain as he took in the scene. Engine fully assembled, wiring harnesses connected, but still no sound of running machinery. "How much longer?" he asked quietly. "We're in the final stages," Jack replied without looking up from the fuel injection computer. "Programming the last fuel maps now." Connor nodded and found a spot against the wall where he could watch without interfering. His presence added weight to the already tense atmosphere. This wasn't just about proving Jack's abilities anymore. It was about giving Connor and Preston Montgomery some measure of peace after 3 years of carrying their guilt. The fuel system pressurization revealed another problem. David's custom fuel pump was sized correctly for the engine's needs, but the pressure regulator had failed sometime during storage. Fuel pressure fluctuated wildly, making proper injection impossible. "We need a new regulator," Dr. Wells said, studying the gauge readings, "and we need it in less than 2 hours. What are the specifications?" Billy Torres asked. He'd arrived an hour earlier with spare gaskets and had stayed to witness the conclusion. Jack read the numbers from David's notes. 43 psi base pressure, rising to 55 under boost conditions. "I've got one," Billy said. "Different brand but same specs, 10 minutes away." As Billy raced to his shop, Jack made final adjustments to the ignition timing. David's notes called for initial timing of 18 degrees before top dead center. Aggressive for a street engine, but necessary for the high compression ratio he'd achieved. "This is going to be a wild ride when it starts," Tony said, checking the timing light readings. Kid built himself a race engine disguised as a street car. Billy returned with the pressure regulator and installation hardware. With 90 minutes remaining, they had all the components in place but still needed to fill the cooling system, check for leaks, and perform final system verification. "Oil pressure looks good," Mason reported, reading gauges as Jack turned the engine by hand. "No, binding, smooth rotation. Cooling systems holding pressure," Eddie added, monitoring the radiator. "Fuel pressures steady at 43 psi, Dr. Wells confirmed. At 6:15, everything was ready except for one final detail, the moment of truth when they would discover if 3 years of tragedy could be transformed into redemption. "Connor," Jack called to the man who'd been silently watching for over an hour. "You should do the honors." "What do you mean?" "Start the engine." David would have wanted someone who cared about him to hear it run for the first time. Connor's hands trembled as he approached the starter button. 3 years of guilt, grief, and desperate hope had led to this moment. If the engine started, it would prove that David's vision had been sound, that his death hadn't been entirely in vain. If it failed, the dreams would die with it. "Any last checks?" Connor asked. "Everything's ready," Jack said. "Just press the button and listen." Connor took a deep breath and pressed the starter. The engine turned over once, twice, 3 times, then caught with a rumble that shook dust from the rafters. But instead of the smooth idle they'd hoped for, it ran rough, misfiring badly, threatening to stall at any moment. "Fuel mixture's too rich," Dr. Wells said quickly, reading the exhaust gas analyzer. "Ignition timing's off," Tony added, hearing the irregular firing pattern. "We've got 45 minutes to tune it," Jack said, already reaching for the adjustment tools. The final hour would determine whether months of work and community support had achieved the impossible, or whether some engines were truly meant to remain silent forever. But as the Ferrari V12 continued its rough idle, filling the shop with the sound of barely contained power, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The engine was running. Now they just had to make it sing. The rough idle was deafening in the confined space, but to Jack's experienced ear, it told a story. The misfiring followed a pattern. Cylinders 7 and 10 were running lean, while the others ran progressively, richer toward the rear of the engine. David's fuel injection mapping was close, but not perfect. "Shut it down," Jack called over the noise. "We need to adjust the individual injector trim." Connor hit the ignition switch, and sudden silence filled the shop like a held breath. 43 minutes remained. "What's the problem?" Connor asked, his voice tight with concern. "Not a problem. Fine-tuning," Jack replied, already opening David's programming notes. The kid got the base fuel map right, but he didn't have time to dial in the individual cylinder corrections. Dr. Wells was studying the exhaust gas readings. On her analyzer, cylinders 1 through 6 are running at optimal air-fuel ratio. 7 through 12 are progressively leaner. "It's like the fuel distribution isn't quite even." "Manifold pressure differential," Tony said, nodding with understanding. "The rear cylinders are seeing slightly less fuel pressure because of flow restrictions in the injection rail." Jack found David's calibration procedure buried in the back of his notes, a step-by-step process for adjusting individual injector pulse width to compensate for exactly this problem. The young engineer had anticipated the issue but died before he could implement the solution. "Here's what we do," Jack said, pointing to David's diagrams. "We increase injector pulse width by 2% for cylinder 7, 4% for 8, 6% for 9, and 8% for cylinders 10 through 12. "How do we input those changes?" Mason asked. Dr. Wells had been studying the fuel injection computer's interface. "These adjustment knobs correspond to individual cylinder trim, but we'll need to start the engine and make changes while it's running." "Like tuning a carburetor," Eddie said. "Exactly like tuning a carburetor, except with 12 separate adjustments instead of 1. They restarted the engine, and Jack began the delicate process of adjusting each cylinder's fuel delivery while monitoring exhaust temperatures and listening to the engine's voice. Years of experience had taught him to hear what each cylinder was doing, to detect the subtle changes that indicated optimal combustion. "Cylinder 7 coming up," he called out, turning the adjustment screw a quarter turn clockwise. The rough note in the engine song smoothed slightly. "Better," Dr. Wells confirmed, watching her instrumentation. "Air-fuel ratio moving towards stoichiometric." Cylinder by cylinder, Jack worked through David's calibration procedure. Each adjustment brought the engine closer to the smooth idle David had envisioned, but the process was painstakingly slow. 28 minutes remaining, and they were only halfway through the cylinder bank. "We need to go faster," Connor said, checking his watch. "Fast adjustments make big mistakes," Tony replied. "Jack knows what he's doing." At 6:47, with 13 minutes left, Jack made the final adjustment to cylinder 12. The engine's idle transformed from a rough rumble to a smooth, purposeful purr that seemed to breathe with mechanical precision. "That's it," Jack said, stepping back from the engine. That's what David was trying to achieve. The Ferrari V12 idled with the controlled power of a sleeping predator. Every cylinder fired in perfect sequence, the fuel injection system delivering precisely metered amounts of gasoline at exactly the right moment. The sound was intoxicating. 12 cylinders working in harmony to create something greater than the sum of their parts. "Rev it up," Connor said quietly. Jack gently pressed the throttle, and the engine responded instantly. The idle climbed smoothly through the rev range, each 1,000 RPM bringing new notes to the mechanical symphony. At 3,000 RPM, the sound became pure music, a baritone growl that spoke of contained violence and sophisticated engineering. "David would have loved this," Connor said, tears visible in his eyes. "He did love it," Jack replied. This is exactly what he was trying to build. But they weren't finished. The bet specified that the engine had to run, but Jack's professional pride demanded more. David's notes included a final step, a full power test to verify that all systems function properly under load. "We need to run it through the complete RPM range," Jack said. David's notes call for a 5-minute test cycle to operating temperature. "Is that safe?" Mason asked. "We're running this thing in a closed garage." "Open all the bay doors," Jack instructed. "Tony, can you back your truck up to the exhaust pipe to help pull the fumes out?" With 7 minutes remaining until Connor's deadline, they prepared for the final test. The shop doors stood open to the evening air, and neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk to witness the conclusion of 2 weeks that had captivated the entire town. Jack gradually increased the throttle, bringing the engine up to 2,000 RPM, then 3,000, monitoring oil pressure, water temperature, and exhaust gas readings. The Ferrari responded flawlessly, each system functioning exactly as David had designed. 4,000 RPM, Jack announced, and the engine's voice rose to a controlled roar that echoed off buildings along Gearworks Boulevard. "Oil pressure steady," Dr. Wells called out. "Water temperature normal," Mason added. "Exhaust gas perfect," Tony confirmed. At 4,500 RPM, the engine reached what David's notes called transition point, the moment where his custom cam timing and fuel injection mapping were supposed to deliver maximum efficiency. The Ferrari's response was immediate and dramatic. Power delivery smoothed even further, and the exhaust note changed from a roar to a controlled scream that spoke of pure mechanical perfection. "Jesus Christ," Connor whispered. "I've never heard it run like this." "Because it never did run like this," Jack replied, holding the throttle steady. "David died before he could finish the calibration. This is the first time his engine has run the way he intended." For 3 minutes, the Ferrari V12 sang at 4,500 RPM, proving that David Montgomery's vision had been sound from the beginning. The engine that 7 mechanics had declared unfixable was running better than it ever had when it was new. "Bring it down," Connor said finally. "It's perfect." Jack gradually reduced the throttle, and the engine settled back to its smooth idle. In the sudden relative quiet, they could hear applause from the crowd that had gathered outside. Word had spread through Steelton that Brennan's Auto Repair was about to achieve the impossible. "Check the time," Jack said. Mason looked at his watch. 2 minutes to 7 o'clock. "We did it," Eddie said, grinning widely. "We actually did it." "David did it," Jack corrected. "We just finished what he started." Connor walked slowly around the running engine, listening to its perfect idle, watching the gauges that showed every system operating within optimal parameters. 3 years of guilt seemed to lift from his shoulders as he realized that David's final project hadn't been a failure. It had just been incomplete. "Jack," Connor said finally, "I need to make a phone call." "To who?" "Preston Montgomery. He's been waiting 3 years to hear this engine run properly." As Connor stepped outside to make his call, Jack stood listening to the Ferrari's idle and feeling something he hadn't experienced since his wife died, complete satisfaction with work well done. They had taken David's interrupted vision and brought it to life, proving that small-town mechanics could achieve results that factory specialists couldn't match. "Mr. B," Mason said quietly, "what happens now?" "Now we shut it down. Button everything. Up and wait to see what Connor has in mind. But the engine works. We proved it runs." "We proved more than that," Jack said. "We proved that good ideas don't die with the people who have them. Sometimes they just wait for the right hands to finish them." At exactly 7 o'clock, Jack reached over and turned off the ignition. The Ferrari V12 died with a final, satisfied sigh, its 12 cylinders falling silent after completing David Montgomery's 3-year journey from tragedy to triumph. In the sudden quiet, they could hear Connor's voice from outside, telling Preston Montgomery that his son's engine was finally running the way it was meant to run. The bet was won, but Jack suspected the real payoff was yet to come. The 3 black SUVs arrived at dawn the next morning, pulling up to Brennan's auto repair in formation like a presidential motorcade. Jack was already in the shop performing final inspections on the Ferrari engine when he heard car doors slamming outside. Preston Montgomery stepped out of the lead vehicle, and Jack immediately understood where David had gotten his engineering mind. At 52, Preston moved with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people. But his eyes carried the unmistakable weight of a father who'd lost his only child. Behind him came Connor, and 3 other men in expensive suits who looked like corporate executives. One carried a briefcase that seemed too important for its size. "Mr. Brennan," Preston said, extending his hand, "I drove down from Atlanta as soon as Connor called. I had to hear it for myself." "It's ready to run whenever you are," Jack replied, noting the tremor in Preston's voice. "Before we start the engine, I need to tell you something. Connor probably explained that David was my son, that he died in an accident involving this car. What he didn't tell you is why this project matters so much to me." Preston paused, gathering himself. "After David died, I shut down his entire engineering lab, closed his projects, transferred his staff, eliminated every trace of his work from Montgomery Industries. I was angry at him for dying, angry at myself for not stopping him. From racing, angry at everyone who'd encouraged his automotive obsessions." "That's understandable," Jack said quietly. "No, it wasn't. It was the reaction of a grieving father, not a businessman who understood innovation. 3 weeks ago, I found David's personal research notes in his apartment. He wasn't just hot rodding. That Ferrari, he was developing technologies that could revolutionize automotive efficiency." One of the suited men stepped forward. "I'm Dr. James Foster from Georgia Tech's Mechanical Engineering Department. I've reviewed David's work. His fuel injection algorithms and combustion optimization theories were 15 years ahead of current industry practice, which brings us to why we're here," Preston continued. "Jack, you didn't just repair my son's engine. You completed research that could change how internal combustion engines are designed. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge?" Jack felt the weight of unexpected responsibility. "I'm not sure I understand." Preston gestured toward the Ferrari engine, now clean and ready for demonstration. David's modifications achieved a 23% improvement in fuel efficiency while increasing power output. Do you understand what that means in today's market? "It means David was smarter than anyone gave him credit for," Jack said. "It means his ideas could save millions of gallons of gasoline annually if applied to production vehicles," Dr. Foster added. "But those ideas died with him until you brought them back to life," Connor spoke for the first time since arriving. "Preston, show him the proposal." The man with the briefcase opened it and removed a thick document bound in leather. "Jack, Montgomery, Industries wants to establish the David Montgomery Automotive Research Center here in Steelton. What kind of research center? A facility dedicated to developing practical applications of David's work, Preston explained. We'd hire local mechanics and engineers, train them in advanced automotive technologies, and use their real-world experience to bridge the gap between laboratory theory and practical application. Jack's mind struggled to process the implications. You're talking about bringing jobs to Steelton, 40 jobs initially, with potential for expansion to over 100 within 5 years. Engineering positions, skilled technical work, manufacturing, support. The kind of jobs this town hasn't seen since the steel mill closed. Mason, who'd been quietly organizing tools in the background, dropped his wrench again. Are you serious? Completely serious, Preston said. But there's a condition. We want Jack to run the facility, not as a manager, but as technical director. Your job would be teaching young engineers what you know about making theoretical designs work in the real world. I don't have engineering credentials, Jack protested. You have something better, Dr. Foster said. You have the ability to look at a complex problem and find solutions that work outside the textbook. That's exactly what we need. Tony Romano appeared from beneath the Ferrari, where he'd been checking fluid levels. Jack, they're offering you a chance to turn your life experience into the foundation for something bigger. What about Brennan's auto repair? You'd keep the shop, Preston said. In fact, we'd want it to become part of the research center, a place where theoretical designs get tested and refined by people who understand how things actually work. The offer was overwhelming, but Jack needed to understand the complete picture. What's the catch? Why would Montgomery Industries invest this kind of money in a town you abandoned when you closed the steel mill? Preston's expression tightened. Because I made a mistake when I closed that mill. I was focused on quarterly profits instead of long-term value. This town has skilled workers, strong work ethic, and community pride. Those are assets I was too arrogant to recognize. And now? Now I'm trying to honor my son's memory by finishing what he started. Not just the engine, but his belief that innovation comes from combining academic knowledge with practical experience. Ava appeared in the shop doorway, having walked over from Rita's diner, where she'd been working her summer job. Dad, Mrs. Patterson said there were important-looking cars outside. Ava, come here, Jack said. I want you to meet some people. As Jack introduced his daughter to Preston and the others, he watched her engage with the same engineering curiosity she'd inherited from both her parents. Her questions were intelligent and focused, impressing the academics and executives equally. Your father tells me you're planning to study engineering at Georgia Tech, Dr. Foster said. If we can afford it, Ava replied honestly. The research center would include a scholarship program for local students, Preston said. Full tuition plus summer internships, working alongside experienced mechanics and engineers. Jack saw his daughter's eyes widen with possibility, but he also recognized the magnitude of the decision he was being asked to make. This wasn't just about accepting a job. It was about betting his family's future on Preston Montgomery's vision of redemption. I need to hear the engine run first, Preston said finally. I need to know that David's work was worth completing. They started the Ferrari, and for 5 minutes Preston stood listening to the perfect idyll his son had dreamed of achieving. When Jack revved the engine through its range, Preston closed his eyes and smiled for the first time since entering the shop. He would have been so proud, Preston said, when Jack shut down the engine. This is exactly what he was trying to build. So, what's your answer, Jack? Connor asked. Jack looked around the shop that had been his life for 15 years, at the community that had supported him through the impossible project, at his daughter whose future hung in the balance, and at the Ferrari engine that represented both tragedy and hope. I have one condition, Jack said finally. Name it. Everyone who helped with this project gets first consideration for jobs at the research center. Mason, Eddie, Dr. Wells, even Billy Torres, if he wants to be part of it. This was a community effort, and the benefits should go to the community. Agreed, Preston said immediately. Anyone who contributed to bringing David's vision to life deserves to benefit from its success. Then yes, we'll do it. The handshake that followed lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. Within 6 months, construction began on the David Montgomery Automotive Research Center on the site of the old steel mill. Within a year, Steelton had transformed from a dying town into a hub of automotive innovation where theoretical engineering met practical experience. Jack kept Brennan's auto repair, but it became the testing ground where young engineers learned to turn ideas into reality. Mason completed his engineering degree through the center's education program and became Jack's assistant director. Ava graduated from Georgia Tech with a scholarship funded by David's research patents and returned home to work on projects that pushed the boundaries of what internal combustion engines could achieve. But the real victory wasn't measured in jobs or economic development. It was measured in the transformation of tragedy into purpose, of failure into innovation, of a community's despair into hope. 5 years later, as Jack watched a new group of engineers install one of David's efficiency modifications into a production engine, he thought about the phone call that had started it all. Preston had been right. What Jack had done with that Ferrari engine had changed everything. Not just for one family, but for an entire town that had learned that sometimes the most broken things aren't beyond repair. They just need the right hands, the right community, and the right understanding of what they're really meant to become. The engine that had sat silent for 3 years now powered research that would improve millions of vehicles worldwide. David Montgomery's interrupted dream had become a legacy that would outlive everyone who remembered him, and in a small town in Georgia, mechanics and engineers worked side by side, proving every day that the best innovations come from combining book learning with the wisdom that can only be earned through years of making broken things work again. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.